Now, this second lesson is going to take a look at the explorations of the European powers, the sales of civilizations. And we'll see the Portuguese and African slavery, and then the Spanish and the English, then the realization that Columbus had not made it to the Eastern Hemisphere, had not made it to China, and then that meant you had to search for a way across the Western Hemisphere. This is the search for the Northwest Passage. Then we'll see the Columbian Exchange, and that is the goods and also germs and diseases that go between Europe and the Americas, the slave trade, and then finally the legacy of the Reformation, which has a strong, strong influence on the American nation. Now, the photograph you see there is the third surviving son of the King of Portugal and the nephew of King Henry IV of England. And for that, he was named after his uncle. His name is Henry the Navigator. Since he was not going to be the King of Portugal, he instead decided that he was going to be a navigator, a man of the sea. And he created the first school of maritime skill, cartography, sailing, and so forth. And it is he who really contributes more to the age of discovery than even Columbus does. And after being able to procure a new ship or a new type of ship called the caravel, this is how we are going to have oceanic exploration at last. And so it is little tiny Portugal that begins the age of conquest. The Portuguese, under the leadership of Henry the Navigator and those ship captains that come out of his school, are able to begin mapping the coast of Africa. And they're using the ship known as the caravel. And they're using the lateen sails. The lateen sails were taken from the Muslim world. See, this is the importance of the Muslim world in the establishment of this nation, is that this nation doesn't get discovered. It doesn't get established. It doesn't get settled because nobody would have been able to go across the oceans without lateen sails. Well, Henry's students discovered the Azores and then got blown off course toward the west and hit the coast of South America by accident. And this is prior to Columbus. Then they go and they begin engaging the Songhai Empire in slave trading. The Songhai Empire is the area around the Savannah region of Africa. Here you see the model of a Portuguese caravel with the lateen sail, that is the triangular sail. Now, why is this important? It's important because it helps you to steer into the wind. These sails are basically giant engines that can capture this wind and use it to your advantage. It allows you to sail over the open oceans. Now the Portuguese captains go to work. They begin hunting and pecking along the coast of Africa. They're still not willing to go out into the ocean other than the accident that happened with Brazil. But Bartholomew Diaz then reaches the Cape of Good Hope in 1487, the Cabo de Buena Esperanza. But the prevailing winds go from east to west there. And so it's very difficult. So Diaz turns around. But then comes Vasco da Gama, who was Diaz's first mate on his voyage. They actually flipped roles, and da Gama took control, and he went all around the Cape of Good Hope and into the Indian Ocean, and then on to India. Everywhere they stopped, the Portuguese established bases. But remember, Portugal is a small nation. It's not a large nation with a large population. So it has the strength to establish bases, but it doesn't really have the strength to establish large colonies per se. As the Portuguese begin to settle into their bases along the coast of Africa, the Spanish and the English now join into the race. And the English were a little bit behind, but the Spanish managed to improve on the Portuguese caravels, and they have the astrolabe, which allows you to navigate by the stars. And this means that you can move away from the coast. Now, both of them being latecomers to exploration meant that both needed new routes that did not compete with the Portuguese. Enter Columbus. The Spanish called him Cristobal Colon. His Latin Italian name was Cristoforo Colombo. He was a Genoese sailor, and he went from kingdom to kingdom trying to lobby for money so that he could finance an expedition to the west. The Italians were not interested. They had the Mediterranean. The Portuguese were not interested because they had the African area locked up. And so the new kingdom of Spain, which had just finished throwing out the Moors and uniting under Ferdinand of Aragon and Isabella of Castile, decides to sponsor. And so Columbus makes his famous voyage in 1492 and then begins 4 subsequent voyages. Columbus, as of course you know, is a very controversial figure. He did massacre the Taino people. He was recalled to Spain on more than one occasion to answer for crimes. Many of his expedition mates turned against him at times because of his high-handed tactics. But you cannot deny that he was the one that had the daring do to make it over to the coast of the Americas, which he did. Spain and England now get into the race to explore. John Cabot, who was actually Giovanni Caboto, was an Italian, and the Italians, you notice, are some of the great sailors because they, of course, had mastered the waters of the Mediterranean. Cabot sails for England. He hits the northeastern coast of Canada in 1497, some 500 years after the Vikings had done so, and begins the English claim to North America and Canada. Amerigo Vespucci was an Italian who sailed for the Spanish. He searched the coast of South America down to the tip of the Tierra del Fuego. It is actually he after whom the Americas are named. So America is named for an Italian. And then, of course, there's Giovanni Verrazano. He's an Italian who sailed for the French, or even later than the English and the Spanish. He searches the Atlantic coast of what later would be the United States, and he is the first European to enter into New York Harbor, although it was not called New York Harbor at the time, of course. Here you see the entrance to New York Harbor, actually the lower New York Harbor and upper New York Harbor, and spanning the passageway between Brooklyn and Staten Island is the Verrazano Narrows Bridge, named in honor of Giovanni Verrazano. This bridge was built in part by a former heavyweight champion boxer named James J. Braddock, nicknamed the Cinderella Man. And it was also made famous in the 1970s disco movie Saturday Night Fever. You can see up toward the top of the pillar seems to point toward the Statue of Liberty further up in the harbor. The joke about Columbus among historians is that he did not know where he was going. When he got there, he didn't know where he was. And when he came home, he did not know where he had been. He was absolutely convinced that he had reached China and the Spice Islands. He was only 12,000 miles off or so. When it became apparent, though, that the Western Hemisphere had 2 continents and then another ocean, people began to say we need to get across them. To go around the tip of South America was a dangerous proposition. So people began to look for a passage toward the north, entering every harbor that they could, thinking this would be the Northwest Passage. The largest of these harbors was actually the mouth of the St. Lawrence River. And here Jacques Cartier, a French explorer sailing for the French, sailed up the St. Lawrence River in 1534. Again, he found out that this great bay then narrowed into a river and would eventually wind up in the Great Lakes. So he begins to settle down there as well and establishes the French Canadian Empire. and begins to settle it with many different families coming out of Normandy more than anything else, one of which is the Le Moyne family, from whom we will get two great explorers of Louisiana, Iberville and Bienville. People begin to come over from Europe to the Americas. They bring with them themselves, their bodies, but they also bring a great deal of other things, both purposefully and unwittingly. And what this comes to be known as is the Columbian Exchange. This is an important thing. The Columbian Exchange is the intentional and unintentional exchange of goods, services, plants, animals, and microorganisms between Europeans and Amerindians. For instance, the Europeans brought animals like domesticated livestock, cattle, horses, pigs, and the earthworm. And the earthworm is very important for breaking up soil. The plants that Europeans brought, cotton, indigo, coffee, tobacco, wheat, barley, millet. These were all purposely brought along, but also going along with them in the holds of these ships were the seeds that got in there and they became weeds like sagebrush. That was a incredibly weed plant. And the weeds then are invasive and they begin to take over the great grasslands of the Americas. What they did not know that they were bringing as well were diseases: measles, typhus, and smallpox. Europeans had been exposed to these diseases for long decades, if not centuries, and they had built up a great deal of immunity and resistance to these diseases. Not that they didn't suffer from it, but they had resistance to it overall. But they are now bringing this disease to peoples who have no resistance whatsoever because they've never experienced this before. The Columbian Exchange did work two ways. Amerindians, for their part, brought animals into the mix, such as longhorn cattle and smaller rodents like the prairie dogs and so forth. They also contributed plants like tomatoes, white potatoes, manioc, squash, beans, and maize. And the potato, of course, is going to be a very important crop in the European matrix. It is also believed that Amerindians contributed their disease, which is syphilis, which is a sexually transmitted disease. And this is not an equal exchange by any account. Smallpox, you only get that disease, or you get that disease through proximity. Syphilis, on the other hand, being a sexually transmitted disease, means that you actually have to engage in some physical activity in order to contract that disease. You can't be caught from proximity. And therefore, the effect of the European diseases is that 90 to 95% of the native peoples of the Americas were wiped out. And these mass epidemics facilitated European conquest. When you think about Cortez and the Aztecs, without smallpox, Cortez is having his heart cut out by an obsidian knife. And what it does is it leaves lands once thickly inhabited in North America wide open to European colonization and land management. The tribes that existed that were denuded of population lost their identity. And in desperation, they were forced to reconsolidate with other numerous tribes, one of which will be the Powhatan tribe of Virginia, from whom Pocahontas came. This is actually a confederation of smaller tribes that come together under the great chief Powhatan. Now, when it comes to slavery, slavery had existed back all the way to the time that the first civilizations came about. And of course, it had been a well-organized system under the Greeks and then the Romans. And then it began to kind of fade off a little bit. But then it was reintroduced as a major economic tool by the Muslims trading across the caravans of Africa. The Portuguese then expanded it, where African slavery, inter-African or intra-African slavery, was basically prisoners of war taken for a period of time. The Portuguese, when they expanded, made slavery a lifetime situation. In the process, more than 9 million human beings would be trafficked from Africa to the Americas. Several million more died either during the passage or because it was capturing slaves was violent combat. Why Africans rather than the Amerindians in the Americas? Well, first and foremost, they were hardier and more reliable as slaves because they were in proximity to Europe and they were resistant to debilitating tropical diseases like malaria, and they were immune to smallpox. Furthermore, if you take an African and take her 3,000 miles across an ocean, they are less likely than the Amerindians to escape. You take an Amerindian as a slave, they can jump the fence in their home in 15 minutes. Africans had to navigate 3,000 miles of ocean. There was nowhere for them to go. One also needs to understand that the Reformation has a strong influence on exploration, on colonization, and on the types of government that would exist in these colonies. Now, when we talk about the Reformation, we often say the Protestant Reformation, and that is part of the Reformation. That's Martin Luther, who you see in the photograph picture right there, John Calvin, King Henry VIII, Huldrych Zwingli, and so forth. These Protestant breakoffs challenge the principle of absolute monarchy and uphold the ideal of individual freedom. Now, in England, Elizabeth I, who inherits the throne from her sister Mary Tudor, who had inherited the throne from her father Henry VIII, compromised with the Protestant factions in England because not all factions were the same in England. You had some that were very close to the Catholic Church, like the High Anglicans, and then you had what you would call dissenters, more Presbyterian, the Calvinists. Well, Elizabeth decides that she's going to be a Protestant queen, and she engages in a deadly game of brinksmanship with the Spanish and their king, Philip II, who was an uber Catholic and had claimed Elizabeth as his own wife at one point. But in all of this, you begin to see in these Protestant movements a more democratic ideal, that individual liberty that one has in their own relationship with God per se. You have the ability to chart your own course, that you are not beholden just to a king. Those more along the extreme ends of the Reformation, that is, the strict Calvinists, the dissenters, and so forth, they felt that England and Germany and Spain and other places in France were too corrupt, too Catholic. They needed fresh ground. They needed a tabula rasa. And so many of these reformers see the Americas as a possible place to practice their religious freedom and to create their own perfect religious communities. This map showing the northern part of Africa, mostly the Sahara and the Savannah, shows the major overland trade routes that the Muslim traders had established over time. And then you see in the squares the European states as they establish their places of slave trading. You'll notice that slaves do not come from all over Africa. They come from a limited part of Africa, the Senegambian region that you see there in the west of Africa, and then further down south off the map, the region of Angola. The legacy of slavery is still found on the African coast. Here you see Cape Coast Castle. This is one of the many so-called slave factories that European traders built on the West African coast. And you can see from the cannonball and the fortress like that this was very much a violent undertaking to take slaves and then protect them from raiders and so forth. This final image is called the Custom of the Indians. It's a woodcut of Italian origin. It dates from around 1500. It's believed to be the first European depiction of Native Americans in the New World. So this brings us to an end of our second day full of notes. There are some things that need to be clarified. First and foremost, it is a sort of a point of doctrine almost for many to defend slavery by saying Africans engaged in it. That is true. That cannot be denied. Africans did engage in slave trading with each other. However, this was more along the lines of a prisoner of war style of trading than it was a lifetime situation. And the removal of people from their native homes over 3,000 miles of ocean is a much different situation altogether. In addition to this, we also have to begin to understand the exploitation that many of these Native Americans, these Indians, whatever you want to call them, underwent when the Europeans came, both from open exploitation and also the fact that they were open to these these diseases for which they had no immunity. There's many things to consider here, and especially when you go through your readings as well, to understand the full scope of how these items all came together, how these conditions and how these situations all came together to create the American nation.